the more I continue to do a deep dive in my identity, who I am, who I aim to be, the stronger of an educator I am, but also more equipped. The more equipped I am to provide brave co-op spaces with students where they also get to explore and craft their identities.
O Au, Estella, o Sinalea.
And this is Gabriel. What's good, family? ¿Cómo está? So, fam, we're finally here. Continental Shifts Podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation with you to kick off our first episode. And just a quick run of introductions. Estella, if you wanted to introduce yourself to the people, please let the people know who you are.
Sure, for sure. Hey, y'all. I am Estella Owima Church, and I'm a teacher in Los Angeles. I teach high school theater and am heavily involved as labor union leader, organizer in our community. And I also run a small nonprofit here in LA called Education Ensemble.
All right, that's what's up, Estella. I'm Gabriel Tanglao, former educator, high school teacher up in Bergenfield, New Jersey, one of the second largest Filipino populations in New Jersey. It's a fun fact. And now I'm working full time with the New Jersey Education Association in the professional development division. So doing some labor organizing work full time, fully focused, supporting educators across New Jersey, specifically with racial justice, racial equity, racial literacy work. And I'm excited to be here for this conversation, Estella. We met, I think, over a year now. So I'm trying to recall what the origin story is of how we connected. And I know it was through some of the NEA conferences, so the National Education Association. I know we were able to connect through some mutual friends, but Estella, do you remember the origin story of how we connected?
I am pretty sure. We were in Denver at NEA Leadership Summit. What I remember clearly or vividly is us at Papados. We were at a Papados. So I'm pretty sure we were in Denver. And yeah, mutual teacher friend connected us. And yeah, the conversation was great at dinner. And we remember us also being at a Mexican restaurant later that weekend, Cantina or something like that, or the Canteen. And the conversation there was, again, everything.
Bam, you just jogged my memory because I was struggling to recall, because I feel like you and I have been connected for a while now, even though it's been short in terms of years. But the NEA Leadership Conference in Denver, that's right. And for people who aren't familiar, NEA, the National Education Association, represents millions of educators across the country. And this was one of their largest conferences, the National Leadership Summit. So when you and I had a chance to connect there, I think it was Stephanie Tejas, who is one of the dope educator labor activists that I connected through the NEA Minority Women in Leadership Training Conference, also sponsored by NEA. But we had a chance to connect on some of our shared roots as Asian and Pacific Island family. So I remember the conversations at dinner, at lunch, when we were breaking bread. We really had a chance to connect on the strength of that. So that actually is really the genesis that planted the seeds of the relationship that grew for us to be at this part. And Continental Shifts Podcast, it feels good that it's arrived, right?
Right. I think, I feel like not soon, very shortly after we met, we mentioned that, we got to have some sort of project or something where those conversations we had get to live, but also get to grow, get to evolve. And we can sort of continue to dig into who we are as educators, as labor unionists, as API folk. And sort of continue walking that journey, that identity journey that so many of us are on or have gone on together as siblings.
For real. And I was recalling, like, at one of the dinners, I think, when we were talking about, sharing some of our story, I was reflecting on being Filipino and just kind of unpacking what that meant in terms of Asian identity in the context of, the Philippine Islands being a Spanish colony for over 300 years. And then that experience of being a first generation Filipino American out here in the States, in New Jersey, which doesn't have a large Filipino population. It's concentrated in a few areas. And then listening to your story of your background, do you mind if I just ask and kind of give, again, our audience a sense of what is your background and how are you coming to the space?
Word. So I am Samoan Nigerian, born and raised in South Central LA. My father is from Calabar, Nigeria. My mother originally from Samoa, Savai'i Samoa. And I am first generation born in the States, and grew up very much while there was a large population of Samoan or Tongan folk in my area growing up, I grew up predominantly in Black spaces, Black American spaces. So even as a Nigerian American, never really having, I guess, authentically African experiences is what I can wrap that up in. And similarly, same for Samoan. And so I didn't begin really searching for my Samoan roots until I was much older. Undergrad, it started, but I really dug deep, took a deep dive, my late 20s and now my early 30s. So I've been taking classes and trying to learn the language and reading every book I can get my hands on. Not a lot has been written on Samoa, but everything I can learn about Oceania and Pacifica, trying to be as connected as I can possibly be to my indigenous roots, both in Samoa and in Nigeria.
Word. And I remember part of that story as you shared it when we first met was inspiring some exploration for me to just dig deeper into my roots and start that journey. So for us to have stayed connected, for you and I to be comrades and fam and just begin to build that relationship, it inspired me to continue exploring. And that's, again, why we're here, Continental Shifts Podcast. Part of our journey here is to be sharing it with the people and lift up some voices of some dope API educators. And that last part is a transition because we mention and proudly name that we are educators, right? And for folks that are listening, I would love for Estella to share, if you could share what was the reason or what was the drive that brought you to education in the first place?
I guess exactly what I just shared about, like, so much of my identity is also wrapped up in what I do, right? Like, those who I am and what I do are really, really closely linked and really feed off of the other. And I am just recently coming to the realization that the better I know myself, like, the more I continue to do a deep dive in my identity, who I am, who I aim to be, the stronger of an educator I am, but also more equipped. The more equipped I am to provide brave co-op spaces with students where they also get to explore and craft their identities. And so I feel like it is definitely part of my service, like part of what I am called to do this work internally so that I can help young people also do that same lift. And it's a heavy lift that takes a really long time. Like, I mean, it wasn't until 29, 30, I learned a sentence in Psalm 1, you know? So, doing my best to remain vulnerable with students and with folks listening to our show, about where I am in that process. I think not only is authentic of me to do, but keeps me honest and focused on trying to do better. And so I came to education to do my best to serve, that's really what that's about. I didn't always have the best experience in my K-12 education, and there were a handful of teachers who, I mean, we all have those stories, right? Those above and beyond, the teachers you're still close with, the teachers you'll never forget their names. And so it just felt like no way in hell I can repay them back, other than to try to pick up where they left off and continue to also build onto their legacies. So like through me, even after the day they retire, so long as I'm making them proud, then their legacy lives on.
Love that. It's not just paying it back. It's like you're paying it forward in spending your life committed to the next generation. And also the way that you name that you came to explore your cultural roots a little more in depth later on in life, that resonated with me because I was thinking about my own journey of how I came into teaching in the first place. And, you know, part of the role of first generation, often the oldest in the family that I am, there's an expectation and a pressure to assimilate to the dominant culture, in part because with my parents being immigrants from the Philippines and coming to the United States, I was almost like a bridge in terms of how do we connect to this new society, this new community in which we live. And that's something that really carried on through most of my childhood. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood, middle class, good public schools in northern New Jersey. And it was a largely white population, a mix, Irish, Italian, German, but largely white population. And I was one of the few Filipino kids growing up. Fortunately, I had camaraderie with a lot of folks, but part of that was just trying to make my cultural dopeness and shine and roots, right? Like I tried to like shrink myself in that way because the role that I saw was to fit in. And that was through my formative years from K-12 for the most part. I think it was later on in high school that I started to, you know, just start to see like, oh, okay, I got a little more flavor because I'm Filipino and what is that about, right? But just only scratching the surface of it. And the way that you named the educators that influenced you, I have to shout out the professor that changed the entire trajectory of my entire future. And it wasn't until college at Pace University in Lower Manhattan. I actually went to Pace University, Estella, because I became a business major. I actually had aspirations in that American dream mythology of like, I'll do good in school. I'll become a businessman, CEO, make money and live the American dream, whatever that looked like in my adolescent mind, right? But it wasn't until my sophomore year of college where I had a course that was the literature of African peoples, and Professor Osei was my professor. And she was this sister that would come into the room, right? And in Manhattan, you can imagine how small the classrooms are. The buildings are all boxed in because, you know, the value of property out there is, you know, a premium. So tiny classroom, but Professor Osei would come into the room dressed in this beautiful kente cloth and just stand in front of the classroom and just start to lecture us in a way that was so compelling and inspiring. But I don't want to take up too much space, but I had to shout out Professor Osei because she introduced me to A Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass, Autobiography of Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, all of the Black intellectuals, revolutionaries that actually planted the seed in my mind on liberation. And it was actually the Black liberation struggle through college that allowed me to become aware and conscious of my own journey, right? And the society in which we live, which put me on a path to become a political science major, became very active in student organizations, specifically the Black Student Union. There wasn't an API student union that was active on my campus. And again, it was the Black liberation struggle and the Black Student Union that was embraced me and all of the energy and cultural awareness that I brought from a different lens. And that put me on track to fall in love with education in a way that carried me into teaching. And to kind of close the loop on the story, I ended up teaching at Bergenfield High School, which was right next to the town that I grew up in. But Bergenfield was a larger Filipino population. So full circle, coming back to the community, but specifically rooted in my own cultural community. So that's kind of the story that took me into teaching. And a lot of what you shared in your story, I felt like there were so many similarities there.
Sitting here thinking the same thing. The exact same thing happened to me too. Undergrad, I went to Cal State Northridge and I mentioned I'm a theater teacher, absolute theater nerd, was definitely a theater major, but picked up Pan-African Studies as a second major. And it was my professors in that department, specifically my mentor, Dr. Karen Stanford, who put me on Black liberation. And that opened up a whole, and it wasn't even just that, it was also digging deep into hip hop studies, hip hop ed, which just busted open a whole new world of insight. And again, being super involved with those organizations on campus. We did have a poly group, and I think this is something, or leads us into the why this show now. Very often growing up, if ever I got the privilege or the chance to be in an API specific space, it was not always a space where I felt safe, right? It was not always a space I felt fully welcome, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it until being an Africana Studies major. Like, then I could process and really think that through and recognize this is your anti-Blackness showing, and it's not a reflection of me or who I am.
I'm so glad you named that, because that's something that we've talked about. I think when we first connected was talking about how we in the API community need to do the work of attacking anti-Blackness within that space, right? How do we unpack that? What is it that puts us into the positions around the model minority myth of being a racial wedge between white supremacy, anti-Blackness, right? Like, how is it that we need to engage our Asian and Pacific Island brothers and sisters within our communities to be able to attack that anti-Black sentiment that is resonant in American culture, right? That's part of it, right? It's an ingratiating yourself to the dominant power structure, right? That said, when I connected with you and when I connect with some of the dope people across the country, specifically within the labor movement, specifically organizing within the community spaces, it's very clear that that's a stereotype that's imposed on us. And part of our conversation today and for the Continental Shifts is to challenge that narrative and lean into the ways, utilizing our educator voice, utilizing our organizing experience, talking about Black liberation struggle and how it intellectually and spiritually infused in us our own awareness around our own liberation as API people. And how do we carry that forward? How do we pay that forward in the work that we do? So I think that takes us to another part of our conversation, which is where we are right now. And in our professional space right now, in this moment, we have to name that we are in an environment where it's just unprecedented due to the global pandemic. White nationalism has taken over the federal government for the past, the history teacher in me is kind of framing this a little differently for the people. One could argue that white nationalism has actually been the norm throughout the very beginnings of colonization on through the present moment. So maybe there's a continuity of white nationalism, but for folks, there's a heightened awareness of how openly racist that the narratives and rhetoric has been, how violent it has been. But I digress. My point is, we are in a moment, right? We're in a moment. So I have to ask Estella, why this show and why right now? And the show is named, again, for the people, Continental Shifts Podcast.
Absolutely. Well, to everyone listening, Gabriel and I have been working to bring you this podcast for several months now. I think as soon as the stay-at-home order started, we started working, getting to work on this. For a few reasons. One, just like you just mentioned, just talked about, I think everyone has a heightened sense of awareness at this particular moment. And as educators and organizers that we are, it is crucial that in our service to our loved ones, to our people, to our comrades, that we use this time, this space, this passion project to elevate all of that and to move forward conversations that we've had in like API spaces, for example, our caucuses within our unions, and really, really like move forward as opposed to continue to have conversations around things like, what do we call ourselves, without framing that differently, right? Like, I feel like we get stuck in this loop. API, AAPI, Asian Americans split up to be, and this is just one example of why this show. But did we pause and recognize or acknowledge that all of those names, none of those names we gave ourselves, right? So as we do this work to uplift young people, to educate, to uplift ourselves and each other, we really have to figure out how we move away from language and tools and names that our oppressors gave us to begin with, right? And really, 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 really make massive continental shifts. And that's what our show is about. So digging into, as you guys continue to rock with us, follow us, we'll have special guests on each episode to dig into really heavy topics. When I say we've been working since March, y'all, we have already planned out 3 seasons. We got guests lined up on deck. We have thought long and hard about, from our logos to the color schemes and the name of the show, in really, really moving forward this work, in a space that is accessible to folks, a space that is laid back, free flowing, and a space that is all ours that we get to name. And it is nothing but love and respect between and with all of the folks who will grace us with their time and their presence on every episode here on out.
I'm excited to listen to the rest of the season. We haven't even recorded it yet, so I'm super excited. I'm super hyped up about it. You're right. The people that we have in our networks, in our relationships, in our community, some of the dopest educators, some of the dopest activists, some of the dopest organizers are out there. So super excited for that. Estella, one of the things that I was thinking about as you were sharing just the labor of love that this passion project has been, I want to shout you out, first of all, for all of the labor that you put into the conceptual vision of this. And I love how collaborative it's been. It hasn't even felt like work. It's felt like just one of those things like, oh, there's so many elements and aspects to it. And part of it is, as we lift up our voices and recognize that this space is unique in this digital environment, in this digital world, how are we connecting with more people? And if the podcast, the Continental Shifts Podcast in particular, is a way for us to lift up voices of other APIs, as you said, lift up our own voices, start to critically analyze the society that's around us so that we can become more sophisticated in our approach to organizing, to shift, not just the state, not just in the community, the entire world. We're talking about continents. We're talking about changing the world here, thinking about the ancestors that survived and were resilient and went through all of the journey to get us to the places that we are like our existence, our lives are due to the ancestors' survival and the gifts that they passed down to us, the wealth, the knowledge, the wisdom, the tradition, the culture, the language, as Estella mentioned earlier. And that's something that I struggle with now, is that I'm stuck in the box of English only in my own language development. So the fact that you are looking into developing an awareness and a consciousness and a skill set to be able to get in touch with your indigenous language roots is just beautiful. And I'm just saying, Continental Shifts happens on so many levels. And one of the unique things, if this is a seed that we pass down, the ways that our ancestors passed down to us, the seeds of wisdom, we're hoping that this passes on some seeds of wisdom to the generations that are currently organizing right now and for generations to come, because this is a turning point. It has to be. It has to be. We can't continue the world as we are seeing it today. It's been that, again, going back to the history roots, the education roots, it was a difficult process, Estella, I'm thinking about that college moment. I'm glad we're having this conversation because I'm like recalling how painful it was. It was so painful to go through most of life like ignorant of all of the craziness that has been what society has been, right? But let's name it United States society, right? Colonization, institutional racism. So we're talking that we're going to get into it in the season to come. So just hope y'all are ready for that. Estella, please enlighten the people. You put me onto wayfinding as a concept. Do you mind kicking some wisdom to the people? Because I love that concept. It resonated with me. It planted a seed with me. What is wayfinding?
So, and I'll say this too. There's a saying in Samoan, and I don't have it in Samoan right now, but it translates to every good fisherman. Even every good fisherman sometimes makes a mistake. So I want to say that just to let you know right off the top on this first episode, every episode hereafter, like this is a dialogue. This is a give and take. This is some, pedagogy of the oppressed, back and forth, all of us together. And so if ever a mistake is made, I'm not above saying my bad and fixing it, addressing it, and moving forward. As you were talking, one thing came to mind, and it's a quote from Audre Lorde. She says, "There is no such thing as a single issue because we don't live single issue lives." And so that's part of where I was, or what I was thinking about when I thought about wayfinding. And I think one of our conversations we had when we first met was about this generational divide that adds a different layer of complication and issues around positionality, oppression, anti-Blackness when we start to think about API folk in our communities. And there really is a generational layer to it all, right? You and I being from the same generation, growing up very similar, that I'm gonna be a business major because I'm a child of immigrants and the American way, and I need to, do better and, make sure everything my parents sacrificed was not for nothing. That's definitely a first gen thing. That's a thing. And so wayfinding, I was thinking through this process, through this show, this passion project, I wanted you, if no one listened to the show, you and I have a space to work our way backwards, forwards, and live in the present, right? So we have an opportunity to continue our identity journeys together, keep reaching as far back as we can and dig. We also get to do that while living in the moment and dealing with these challenges we are faced with what education looks like in a global pandemic, but we also get to dismantle as much of it as possible so that there is a new future, right? Like we're going to do this differently. There is no back to normal because don't nobody want to go back to normal, right? Like the shit wasn't working then. It's not going to work after a global pandemic. So, yeah. So you got in front of you guys today, 2 dope bi-coastal educators wayfinding their way from the past to the present and to the future.
One of my favorite hip hop artists, Jay-Z, one of the things that he talked about in his first album, well, the Reasonable Doubt album, which is the classic album, he said that's one of his favorite albums because he was spitting it just for his circle. He wasn't spitting for commercial success. That was like, there was something pure about him talking to the people that he rolls with, his crew. So, Estella, one of the things that I'm thinking about in this space, I'm feeling like this is our Reasonable Doubt to me, because I'm talking to you, I'm talking to my people out there, I'm talking to Stephanie, I'm talking to EK, I'm talking to all our people out there that are listening in, tuning in, that's considered fam to us. And that's something that I hope to bring into this space, that purity of energy that we're just, again, there's going to be some folks that might not tune in. There's some folks that might not rock with us. And that's okay, because we're here building the space for us, just like you said, for the people that have experiences similar to ours, that are trying to navigate this complex Babylon space. You know, how are you defining continental shifts? I'm wondering to the people, how are you living your continental shift? How are you creating those waves? How are you exploring and wayfinding, tapping into your ancestors, our ancestors, because we share them, because we're family? And just, I'm excited. I'm excited, Estella. I'm hyped up. You can't even, if you can't tell, I'll name it. I'm hyped up for this.
So we're hoping that everyone stays tuned for the rest of season 1, because we got a whole lot to talk about and unpack just in season 1. Today was really about Gabriel and I introducing ourselves, introducing the show and what Continental Shifts and what it's about. But as we move forward, we're going to continue to dig into wayfinding, what that is, what that's about. And we've got special guests coming on to talk about that. We'll be digging into anti-Blackness within API spaces and really dialoguing on how we work to uproot that within our community so that we can really move our work forward. Special guests will be on for that episode too. Then we're going to dig into API educator pipeline. We are educators, and everything we do, even through this podcast, education is always a part of what we do, or teaching is always a part of what we do. So we want to figure out in what ways can we ensure that API students all across the country have educators who look like them in their classrooms. We're going to dig into organizing and figure out what are the best practices, best ways to really organize API spaces. Maybe that means looking at Asian communities differently than we organize in PI spaces. I don't know, but join us for that conversation. And then we'll wrap up the season with really talking about giving space to preserving our language and our culture. And in Samoa, they say that the way you carry yourself is a part of your identity. And without our language and culture, we lose a part of who we are. So join this dialogue. Be a part of this dialogue with us.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Afat Fatai Talalava, thank you for listening.
Salamat. Thank you for listening, fam.
We want to thank you all one more time for rocking with us, rapping with us tonight. We appreciate you.
Continental Shifts Podcast can be found on Podbean, Apple, Spotify, and any other place you get your podcasts.
Be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube for archived footage.
And make sure you join our mailing list for updates at conshiftspodcast.com. That's CONSHIFTS podcast.com. And follow us at C_shifts on all social media platforms.
Dope educators wayfinding the past, present, and future.
Keep rocking with us, fam. We're going to make continental shifts through dialogue, with love, and all together. Peace.
So far, deuces.